Well, now I'd like to introduce this afternoon's 2 p.m. panel on the iconic Midwest. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Professor Riney-Kehrberg from Iowa State.
Good afternoon, everybody. What I'm going to do is introduce all of our panelists right up front, and then we'll just get up and give their papers in the order in which they've been introduced. We'll be hearing first from John Miller, who is a professor emeritus of history from South Dakota State University. In the last, 15 months, he has seen the publication of a very large book that's sitting there in front of him at the table on small town boys. He is going to be talking to us today about the small town Midwest. After him, we will be hearing from David Good, who is a professor emeritus from the University of Minnesota. He is a recent convert to Midwestern history, having spent most of his career researching the history of Central Europe. So this is a new adventure for him. He will be talking today about the Midwest as an economic engine in the period prior to World War I. Our third speaker is Chris Langen. He is a newly tenured and newly associate professor of geography at Eastern Illinois University. He is currently working on a book on American farms and American food, and he will be talking to us about the agrarian Midwest.
Thank you very much, Pam. It's wonderful to be here. Beautiful day, beautiful place, wonderful people. Thank you for coming out, for being part of this, what will prove to be, I think, as Glebe said this morning, a historic event in the history of the Midwest and the historical profession. I'd like to thank Gleaves Whitney for hosting this, the Hauenstein Center, and to Ralph Hauenstein himself, who in the handout we got, obviously is a personal hero, and for his generosity. And I'd like to thank my former student, John Lauk, at South Dakota State University for his vision and his creativity, his energy in spearheading this Midwestern History Association. I'd like to think at least I didn't do anything to stand in his way. And by the way, another panelist here, Chris, whom I really didn't know when he was a student, is another student at SDSU, getting his bachelor's degree and his master's degree there. So maybe that's a good advertisement for what we have done in Brookings, both of these guys. For years, I've had a personal interest in small towns, and particularly in Midwestern small towns. I grew up in 6 of them, 4 of them in Missouri, so I'm a Missouri boy. Last year, I wrote this book, Small Town Dreams. I gave you a big, thick book. If you don't want to read it all, you can use it for a doorstop. But I took my usual morning walk this morning around Grand Rapids, and I see the name of DeVos and Van Andel, and so forth. And I figure in the good spirit of Midwestern small towns, I'll be a little bit of a booster and crass commercial advertising for my book, Small Town Dreams. And you'll hear a couple of examples in this talk this morning referring to some of those people, including Sinclair Lewis, who you heard about in the last talk, but not that much, really. And so in the short time we have available to here, I would like to focus on 4 themes as they come along. First of all, the images, the myths, and the symbols surrounding small towns. Secondly, place. Thirdly, time or history. And fourthly, structures. And if there's anything that I leave out of this, which I certainly will, just pick up my book and read about it there, right? Writing in 1923, Minnesota-born Thorsten Veblen famously characterized the country town as being one of the great American institutions, perhaps the greatest in the sense that it has had and continues to have a greater part than any other in shaping public sentiment and giving character to American culture. For the first 3 centuries or so of American history, for the vast majority of the population, small towns had been the centers of economic activity, the pillars of society, and the heartbeat of culture. What was true for the country as a whole seemed doubly true of the Midwest, the region of the country that more than any other was associated with and defined by life in its small towns. Iconic status became attached to Mark Twain's Hannibal, Willa Cather's Red Cloud, Sinclair Lewis's Main Street, Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, and Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little Town on the Prairie. These kinds of places are deeply embedded in American thought, memory, and folklore, inspiring songs, poems, literature, and art. And there's the rub. Any objective consideration of Midwestern small towns must distinguish between the image they present on the one hand and the reality of things on the other, and between people's memories, constructions, likes, and dislikes, over against the realities of small town history and development as best can be described and analyzed to the degree that any observer can be objective about it. So let's stipulate at the outset, along with cultural critic Max Lerner, the almost universal ambivalence with which both small town insiders and outside observers regard these small towns. Nostalgia and its opposite, knee-jerk criticism, are always tempting lures, but we should remain on our guard to try to avoid both as best we can. So 1, image, myth, and symbol. The myth of small-town goodness, neighborliness, mutuality, and goodwill was a direct descendant of Thomas Jefferson's agrarian myth of rural virtue and superiority. The single most important purveyor of the small-town myth may well have been the beloved Indiana poet James Whitcomb Riley, who apotheosized small towns and the rural life in sentimental poems such as When the Frost is on the Punkin, The Old Swimmin' Hole, and the Little Town of Tailhote. His popularity and stature reached such great proportions that at his death in 1916, the whole country mourned his passing in ceremonies and commemorations. Nostalgia for the small-town way of life remained strong enough in 1938 to spur huge public response for Thornton Wilder's appreciative tribute to it in his play, Our Town. But the mid to late teens, referred to by historian Henry F. May as the end of American innocence, probably mark, if such a period can be pinpointed, the height of the small town's appeal and the beginning of the myth's demise. If a single representative image of Midwestern small towns had to be chosen, it might well be a long shot taken down Main Street from the railroad depot, showing a block or two or more of stores forming walls on either side and converging at some vanishing point in the distance. Warm memories of Marceline, Missouri, Walt Disney's hometown, and that's the picture we have on the cover of our book here. His hometown between ages 4 and 9 prompted him to install Main Street as the entry point to both Disneyland in 1955 and Walt Disney World in 1971. Meredith Wilson's fond memories of parades on Main Street and of all the important gathering spots in Mason City, Iowa, inspired him to write a musical play, The Music Man, about his hometown, a bouquet to small towns everywhere. When people approached towns from a distance in horse and buggy, or in a car or on a train, they were usually presented with a horizontal image, wider for large towns, narrower for small ones. With regard to the vertical dimension, the tallest structures on the horizon were usually church spires representing the religiosity of communities, grain elevators reflecting their commercial nature, and water towers, indicators of the collective spirit of populaces that provide necessary services for themselves through democratic political processes. A hotel or some other structure of 4 stories or more would be a sure sign of a community or of individuals within it of some wealth or pretension. 2, place. The visual images people retain of small towns and the mental images they store in their minds are always more or less accurate, more or less fantastic. The actual places in which Midwesterners grew to maturity were, in the first instance, just that, places. In keeping with their predominantly commercial origins, aesthetics was not usually a high priority in these small towns. Business districts made little pretense to beauty, Lewis Atherton observed. Rather, efficiency and practicality mattered most. Towns were functional, and the stores on Main Street performed a variety of practical functions. Thus, the familiarity and redundancy of so many descriptions offered up in newspaper stories, fictional accounts, local history books, and scholarly tomes on the look of small towns. Sinclair Lewis's description of Main Street protagonist Carol Kennicott's memorable 32-minute initial walk up and down Main Street in the fictional town of Gopher Prairie, Minnesota, provides a classic example of this phenomenon. Calling Gopher Prairie's Central Business Street the continuation of Main Streets everywhere, Lewis went on to describe the Minniemashie House Hotel, a tall, lean, shabby structure, catering to traders and traveling salesmen. Dyer's Drugstore with its greasy marble soda fountain. The Rosebud Movie Palace showing a film called Fatty in Love. Howland and Gould's Grocery with Knights of Pythias, Maccabees, Woodmen, and Masonic lodges located in rooms above on the second floor. Dahl and Olson's Meat Market, a jewelry shop with tinny-looking wristwatches, several saloons, and I cut out as much and a score of similar stores and businesses. With some variation in particular kinds of business and considerable differences based on the sizes of the towns being considered, this could have been a description of almost any Midwestern small-town business district that catered primarily to farmers during the last several decades of the 19th century and the first several of the 20th. Towns like the fictional Gopher Prairie or its real-life inspiration, Sauk Center, certainly could vary in their appearance, modernity, efficiency, and sociability, but what mattered more in the opinions that people harbored of them were the attitudes and predilections that they brought with them. Whereas Carol Kennicott was inclined to employ words like drab, forbidding, muddy, dismal, rickety, greasy, sleazy, broken, and curdled in describing what she encountered, B. Sorensen, a young woman right off the farm after viewing the same sights, used words like swell, fine, lovely, big, high, dandy, and elegant. Carol herself was conflicted from the very beginning, allowing that many of the things that she observed indeed were pleasant, new, neat, clean, shiny, pure, and even exquisite. This points to the ambivalence with which even strong critics of small towns often tempered their descriptions. And we heard a fine example in Hank Meyer's speech in the last hour, the ambivalence that Sinclair Lewis himself harbored toward those small towns. The most notable design aspect of small towns was the grid layout that most of them adhered to. The earliest towns established north of the Ohio River during the late 1700s and early 1800s may have developed in unplanned fashion at the outset, and topographical peculiarities such as rivers, lakes, valleys, and hills may have boxed some of them in on one or more sides. For the most part, however, the grid was easily extendable as new additions were tacked on to original plats in serial fashion. In practice, this brought about a paradoxical situation. Standardized plats dictated uniform widths of lots, streets, and alleys, and made for what many perceived to be highly boring vistas. Within these parameters, however, the marketplace allowed owners of land and buildings to do pretty much as they pleased with their properties, subject to certain zoning restrictions and regulations adopted over time. The cookie-cutter appearance of many town plats, especially in the western parts of the region in places established after 1880, was usually the result of railroad companies imitating the work of the Illinois Central Railroad during the 1850s, when its subsidiary land company laid out main streets parallel to the tracks and assigned identical street names in town after town. Grand urban designs with large streets, elaborate fountains and structures, and impressive buildings such as those contained in Daniel Burnham's extensive 1910 Chicago plan were almost entirely absent in small towns. But even as individual entrepreneurs made their decisions, things got sorted out in predictable ways. For example, livery stables, lumber yards, coal lots, and many of the hotels in small towns tended to congregate down by the railroad tracks. Banks often bought up higher-priced corner lots. Desirable locations on Main Street often went to general stores, drug stores, hardware stores, and newspaper offices. In most cases, doctors, dentists, and lawyers' offices, along with other business offices and departments, went into second-floor spaces above the various stores. Churches, lodge halls, post offices, city halls, libraries, and other public buildings tended to be located at the edge of or near the downtown business district. The more elegant homes often congregated on a tree-lined street or on a hill. In general, however, there was much less class-based residential segregation in small towns than there was in larger towns and cities where class divisions were more prominent. Courthouse squares surrounded on all four sides by business blocks were more common in the southern Midwest than in the northern part of the region. Courthouses, grade schools, high schools, and colleges tended to be located off to the side of downtown or in a prominent location like a park, grove of trees, or on a hill. Baseball diamonds, skating rinks, county fairgrounds, high school basketball courts, and other places of amusement were often built on the edge of the residential section at the time. Lower forms of entertainment, such as pool halls, saloons, and brothels, tended to be set apart informally from the more respectable parts of town, but there were always exceptions to every rule. The arrival and maturation of the automobile did some major reconfiguring of townscapes. Hitching posts disappeared from downtown streets. City councils were pressured to gravel or hard surface the main business streets and some of the side streets. Many stores went out of business over time as town residents often opted to shop in towns down the road that had more variety and better deals, and everything tended to spread out more, reducing the gravitational pull of the town center. With more highway traffic, downtown hotels gave way to tourist camps and motels on the edge of town, and cafes and restaurants made room for franchised food operations. Automobile and farm equipment dealers, bowling alleys, gas stations, and other businesses catering to car traffic formed commercial strips that tended to take on the same look, making it difficult to tell one town from another, although town boosters continued to plant welcome signs out on the edge. Welcome to Lake Preston, the town designed with you in mind. And almost inevitably, a wall bearing the logos of churches and/or civic groups such as Rotary, Kiwanis, Lions, Altruza, 4-H, and Girl Scouts announced to travelers that this was a progressive, go-getting community. 3, history. As these observations suggest, no discussion of small towns can proceed very far without noting the importance of history. While it may have seemed to many that small towns never changed, in fact, they all were dynamic change agents in many respects. The only questions were whether those changes would be faster or slower, and whether they'd be for the better or for the worse. When considering local history, it is always tempting to focus primary attention on town foundings and on the early years of development, being sure to mention the first examples of everything, but often not bothering to consider very much how things were constantly changing decade by decade. But for small towns, as for everywhere else, history, like place, matters. This is not the place to attempt to give any kind of definitive survey of change over time, but a few observations are in order. Towns were founded for many reasons, but for the vast majority of the several thousand small towns in the Middle West, serving agriculture as a middleman for shipping out livestock and crops, as well as for importing every sort of farm implement and input, as well as consumer items for the home, was the central function they performed, and the primary reason for the various businesses that sprang up like weeds in spring. Of course, beyond serving as agricultural service centers, there were many other functions that small towns implemented. Early on, they were often located along Indian trails or near Indian encampments or government forts, location along transportation routes, roads, road interchanges, rivers, other navigable streams, and lakes often explained why towns were where they were. When canals and railroads came along, there were huge incentives for towns to be built along them. In addition to business and commerce, town founders were also motivated by their desire to acquire county seats or even state capital designation, and the Midwest was especially well known for its many county seat fights. Government facilities and activities of many types put money into residents' hands over time. Post offices, K-12 schools, colleges, universities, soil conservation offices, hospitals, veterans facilities, Social Security and Medicare checks, crop subsidies, and so forth. Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio, Grinnell College in Davenport, Iowa, and Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, all benefited and helped establish the identities of those small towns. Lumber mills, flour mills, meatpacking sites, and other food processing facilities were all important. Tourism, hunting and fishing, casinos, sports facilities, and other kinds of recreational attractions all became more important functions of small towns after World War II. Several broad but tentative generalizations can be proffered. In general, the larger towns have done substantially better than the smaller ones in thriving economically and holding on to or even increasing their populations. Towns below 1,000 or 500 in population are almost destined to decline and maybe even to cease to exist. There go any political aspirations I might have in South Dakota. One of the most prominent newer functions of small towns is to provide living places for retirees, and especially if they have a hospital or nursing home facilities to provide health and assistance to the elderly sick. Beyond that, small towns within 30 or even 50 miles from larger towns or cities often emerged as bedroom communities for the larger place. Cheap housing and being, quote, a good place to raise children, unquote, are two of the major attractions of towns on the urban fringe, and the major reason why many of them are so relatively vibrant. Another broad generalization is that towns located along major highways and especially along interstates have at least the potential for thriving and growth. One has to be careful, however, in this regard, for many, if not most of the towns along interstates enjoy only small advantage from gasoline and tourism sales to people traveling along the highway. 4, structure. Beyond the themes of image, place, time or history, and function, one can also observe how various kinds of structures affected small towns, having already talked a bit about physical structure as embodied in place. Social structure or class is a perennial subject of interest for people living in small towns as well as elsewhere. Americans have always been reluctant to admit the relevance of class distinctions or even to talk about them, and I would say this is doubly true of Midwesterners. Residents of the region are, in fact, very much beholden to a notion of middle-class bourgeois values, behaviors, and relationships. That said, most observers and analysts over time have detected the presence of class divisions and distinctions, maybe not as great as in the South, where the split between white slave holders and black slaves, as well as non-slave holding whites, was much more visible and real, or for that matter in New England and the Northeast, where much larger accumulations of wealth likewise made for a more visible aristocracy of wealth and position. If small towns have always displayed class differences, it is also true that in most circumstances those differences have been less extreme than in more urbanized places. In their studies during the 1920s and 30s of Middletown, Muncie, Indiana, Robert and Helen Lind discerned the presence of a, quote, power elite, unquote, that in many ways presided over the community. Whereas economic distinctions and social structures were sometimes fuzzy and blurred, difficult to ascertain and hard to grapple with, gender divisions remained distinct and determinative far into the 20th century, beginning to shift significantly only after World War II. This is not to say that women were not generally honored and respected, but it is to indicate that women's roles were clearly demarcated in many areas of life, and attempting to modify them or to end gender discrimination was extremely difficult. Again, it is important to note that women worked as hard as men, but usually at home, raising children, taking care of the household, maintaining gardens, participating in church societies and civic organizations, and usually for no pay. Some women worked with their husbands or took over family businesses after they died. A few owned businesses of their own, especially haberdasheries and beauty shops. Many served as clerks in stores, waitresses, cooks, and so forth. Black women generally worked as maids, and young immigrant women often worked as domestic help in the middle and upper middle-class homes. But outside of the home, the two occupations women were generally funneled into were school teaching and nursing. That changed after World War II as increasing numbers of women moved directly into all areas of the economy. Just as in urban households, women broke down barriers that had existed for centuries and millennia, and life literally was transformed for half of the population, and for the other half too, for that matter. Well, having gotten this far and really gotten to the end of my time here, one could list all the things that haven't been talked about here, mainly things like church, school, and home, politics, leisure time activities, recreation, voluntary organizations, deviance, social control. But I don't feel too guilty because I've had about as much time as anybody's going to have here. And I'd just like to finish by saying that history, after all, is about people. And this talk has been mainly at the very abstract level, but we know that it's not only the people, the movers and shakers, like the kind of people who have made this conference possible through their great generosity, but it's the ordinary people. We want to hear their stories. We want to know where power lies and how it works. We want to know about the people who make history, both the leaders, the followers, the hangers-on, and all those small-town residents that I've lived with almost entirely throughout my entire life, which may be why I've been so interested in thinking about and writing about small-town history. Thank you very much.
Well, it seems like everybody needs to thank John Lauck for inviting them, and I'm certainly one of them. As you heard, I'm not a Midwest historian yet, but I have a passion for Midwest history, so I really appreciate his willingness to cultivate my passion and to be able to learn from the rest of you. And it's also a double irony that I was on the panel with John. I was raised in a small town in Illinois, and when I had my epiphany that I wanted to pursue something other than the economic history of Central Europe, the first thing I thought about was my small town, which I had been away from for many, many years. And I thought, I need to find out about small towns, which then morphed into reading Andrew Caton's book on the Midwest, and I thought, yeah, it's the Midwest. That's what's been bugging me since we came back to Minnesota. So I appreciate all these invitations. So my task is to give my views on how and to what extent the Midwest served as an economic engine in the 19th century. And what I'd like to do is step back in time, because it turns out that some of the reasons may be historical. If we go back to the period in, say, the year 1000 to 1350, it turns out that not far from where I was raised, unbeknownst to me, was this small town actually now, of Cahokia, Illinois. And this was the site of a major Mississippian culture settlement. It was the heart of this river system that was sending people in boats up the Missouri, up the Mississippi, down the Mississippi, up the Ohio River. And they had all the civilization accoutrements that one would want, pottery and basket making, definitely settled agriculture. And they didn't have like what's in the Southwest, but there were these gigantic mounds, and Monk's Mound in Cahokia is as large as any of the structures, not as complex as exist in the Mayan cultures to the south. Then if we fast forward to the 17th, the late 17th and then in the 18th century, then we have the Midwest, the same chunk of ground, serving as one of the venues for the worldwide fur trade. And we know that was a big, those of us that live here know that was a big deal. And someone did mention that in passing this morning. But the fur trade was important, at least from my point of view, as a person that's moved back to the Midwest and has been exposed to American Indian cultures. It was the middle ground that Richard White has spent a wonderful book on, where the fur trade didn't require settlement. There was settlement, but the point was not settlement, unlike British colonialism, which that was the main point of British colonialism. But in the case of French colonialism, at least here on the North American continent, the idea was to get as many furs, many beaver pelts out as possible. And this required the expertise of the American Indian population. So this middle ground of intermarriage and not necessarily buddies, but realizing that to do what needed to be done required cooperation. And that ended, of course, when the French were defeated in the 7 Years' War, and I leave that to John to tell you all about. That's not my specialty. So what happened was that the middle ground kind of went in abeyance, and once the Northwest Ordinance came out, it seemed pretty clear that, at least in retrospect, that was a blueprint for the annihilation of American Indians and their culture. Whether it was planned that way or it just happened because nobody really realized the implications, one doesn't know. But it was a serious change in, at least from my point of view, a serious change in what American Indian and Anglo relationships might have been had there been no British colonialism and then the Industrial Revolution. So as for the main issue that I'm speaking about, it turns out that a lot of economic historians have done, they're mainly economists, as those of you historians know that economic history migrated from history to economics after World War II for reasons that are too much to go into at this point. So a lot of my colleagues have done a huge amount of work on the economic history of the US and of the Midwest region. They just don't think of themselves as doing Midwest history. It's usually for some kind of a theoretical point or some kind of a more general economic history point that they want to get across. But there are, fortunately, people that do this kind of work, and that's the economic geographers. So I picked out two that I thought were pretty interesting to take as a way of understanding how industrialization in the Midwest was a vehicle for being an economic engine, to use that terminology. One is David Meyer, and he actually published this work in the Journal of Economic History. He's asking a question, considering the head start of the Northeast in industrialization in the United States, how come the Midwest was able to get a foothold and actually compete against them? And his argument is that, and really he's not so much talking about where we are here, he's talking about more the Northwest, the eastern part of the Northwest Territory. He says that what happened was that the industrialists in the East were facing lots of difficult marketing issues and transportation costs that opened a window for Midwesterners to leap through. And that window was from roughly 1850 to 1880. So what happened was that there was a growing demand for, internally in the Northwest because of the movement in, a demand for manufactured goods. And these Midwesterners were able to pop up and satisfy the demand and get a foothold in the Midwest before the Northeasterners could come in and be competitors. And an economic historian who I greatly respect, he was head of the Economic History Association at one time, said, well, this is actually a good thing because, and this is a quote, the Midwestern area east of the Mississippi would have remained like that in the West, almost entirely a land of farmers, grain merchants, ranchers, meat processors, and a rich market for Eastern and European manufacturers. That was his vision of what would have happened if there hadn't been this window that was closed by by people in Ohio and maybe Indiana, well, along the whole shore of the Great Lakes. The counter to that is written by another, in this case, two geographers, Brian Page and Richard Walker. And they kind of turn that argument on its head, or I think that's one way of viewing it. The other way of viewing it is that Meyer was talking about a very small part of the Midwest. And once you get away from the Great Lakes, especially right along the Great Lakes, then the argument has no bearing whatsoever. He turns it on its head by saying that industrialization in the Midwest grew up locally out of the rich agricultural and resource base that we have here, not on top of it. That was kind of Richard Meyer's idea, that on top of this land, industry was built. Where for him, for these two, the main issue was agriculture, so that industry grew out of agriculture. And they talk about agro-industrialization. That is the heart and soul of what the Midwest did. It's not the factories and the steel mills that are along the Great Lakes. That's important, but it's not as important as the industry that was spawned by out of agriculture and resources more generally. So they focus on the processing of food and resources, flour milling, meat packing, lumbering, tanning, distilling. Many Midwest cities grew up out of this. The mills of Minneapolis, where I'm from, that's agriculture. And ultimately, resources are typified by Grand Rapids, which had very high-level furniture manufacturing. It was called the Furniture City at one time because of the furniture. So that came out of the lumber that was taken down from the north and then turned into, the trees and then the lumber, and then this fine furniture that made it to the Furniture City. So what happened over time was that the Midwest formed a unique industrial belt of its own, not as an import from the East, but out of the soil of the Midwest. And it was never merged into the East Coast one, and which is the argument that Meyer makes, that essentially it was one big manufacturing belt in the East. And that's what makes the Midwest in economic history. It's agro-industrialization. It's not what's out there. It's part of it, but it's not the heart and soul of who we are. And now, another feature of so that's what the nature of the engine is, what that's all about. The other thing I wanted to talk about was this economic engine idea. And I didn't know how to approach it, but I'm kind of a data person still. And one thing that we can say about the Midwest is that it had a pretty low starting point. In fact, I'll go back a little further. In 1790, the South Atlantic southern slave states had an income per capita which was pretty similar to both the Mid-Atlantic and the New England states. There wasn't a whole difference. By 1840, the Atlantic South, or the South more generally, was 50% below the Northeast, New England and Mid-Atlantic. They were at half the level, and so was the Midwest. The Midwest was about half the level of the Northeast. By 1880, so that's 40 years hence, and 15 years after the Civil War, the South was at barely one third of the level that the Northeast was, and the Midwest had climbed to 70% just in that short period of time. And then in 1900, the South was still at one third, which meant it was growing, but it wasn't growing any faster than anywhere else, so it couldn't begin catching up. And the Midwest was at a level that was 85% in 1900 of the per capita income of the Northeast. So that meant that the Midwest was growing much faster, so its relative income was stopping, was getting closer. Another way to look at this is trade. The Midwest, both the Midwest and the East, the Northeast, had pretty low exports. Exports to output was a fairly low ratio, about 2 or 3%. It surprised me actually that the East was like that. I would have assumed that it had been more. But the Midwest was particularly aggressive in marketing the goods to the Northeast, interregionally, out of the Midwest into the Northeast. And by 1910, 20% of the output in the Midwest was being shipped interregionally, most of it to the east and not to the south. In the case of the South, just by comparison, it had this very, very low per capita income, and also, as you might expect, its major export was cotton, either to the New England mills or abroad. 20% of its output was being exported mainly in the form of cotton, whereas Midwest exports were out of these, the food processed and the resource processed commodities. So that's really about all I have to say, but I did want to read something from Bill Parker, who seemed to buy the idea that it was really critical for the eastern part of the Midwest to become industrialized like the Northeast was. He says he wrote a long 3-part essay on the Midwest. He's the only economic historian I know that's done that. I need to do some Google searches just to make sure I'm not fibbing about that. Anyway, I think this quote kind of captures things quite well about the whole economic engine thing and goes beyond it. The heady spiral of solidly based growth in supplies and in demand gave to the Midwest economy and culture in the late 19th century a vigor, a zest, an optimism, and self-assurance which made further accomplishment easy and growth apparently endless. From 1880 to 1930, the Midwest was America, in quotes. You all know that people were saying that all the time, but I was kind of surprised that he said that as an economic historian. Its vision of itself, its self-confidence, had a physical base in rich resources and fortunate self-reinforcing efficiencies of production, won over flat terrain, and by its homogeneous culture that radicals suspiciously called market capitalism and bourgeois democracy, it was America. And this is one way of understanding from the economic side of things how it came to be that the Midwest is a lost region. It became so identified through its economic power with the rest of America, or everyone aspired to that. Even the Easterners were concerned that they were going to be overtaken by the Midwest, that's how we lost our identity, which we're trying to find. That's the whole point of what we're all doing at this point.
Well, while we get the computer set up here, just want to thank John also for inviting me. He said before, I think he was referring to his wife, who's a Norwegian Lutheran, and John has an affinity for Norwegian Lutherans, which I also am, so maybe that's why he invited me here today. Also want to thank the Hauenstein Center folks for making this a very easy conference to come to and present at. Thank you for having bent over backwards to make everything here very accommodating for all of us. So I am a geographer, as was already mentioned. I could bore you with what I really do as a geographer, which tends to be analyzing satellite imagery using some fairly sophisticated high-end sorts of analyses to look at land cover change, and predominantly agricultural land cover change over the past 2 or 3 decades. The problem with that is that satellites weren't around back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So sort of my second job, or the other thing that I really enjoy doing, is sort of being more of a traditional regional geographer. There aren't many of us left these days. And actually wading very deep down into the census of agriculture data and things like that, and then actually going out in the Midwest, in these rural areas, taking pictures, talking to farmers, and trying to get a feel for really what's happening at ground level. So my talk today will be talking about agriculture in the Midwest, specifically related mostly to the Corn Belt and how it's evolved over the last century or so, and then a little bit at the end about some general patterns of change on some other aspects of the agricultural landscape. So, clicker. I don't have the clicker. Does the arrow work too? Arrow's fine. Agriculture may well be the most comprehensive of geographic topics. It involves modification of both the biological and physical components of the environment and incorporates social and economic components with distinctive spatial manifestations. Simplifying the complex by creating regions has been vital to the discipline of geography, a skill set, one of identifying and describing regional characteristics, that has been described as the highest form of a geographer's art. Agricultural studies have long been an important aspect of geographic inquiry. Geographers such as Northwestern University's John Hudson and the University of Minnesota's John Fraser Hart are my discipline's go-to scholars with respect to understanding the rural and agricultural landscape of the U.S., and especially the Midwest. And for nearly a century, economists and geographers alike, from Oliver Baker in the 1920s to F.F. Elliott and the USDA in the 1950s, to more recent work by folks like myself and Fraser, have tried to understand what makes the agricultural landscape of the Midwest tick. And in the case of these boundaries, various takes on the actual boundary of the Corn Belt itself. I grew up in the Midwest on a typical farm in southern Minnesota. My family came here from Norway in the late 1800s. We settled in southwestern Minnesota in the southwest corner of Watonwan County. On my grandfather's 160-acre quarter section in section 34 of Odin Township, 2 miles west of the small town of Odin, population 150, and 1 mile north of St. Olaf Lutheran Church. So how's that for being Scandinavian? We were also surrounded by many other Scandinavians: Petersons, Haugens, Hansons with an E and Hansons with an O, Carlsons, Johnsons, all apparently because the snowdrifts weren't big enough back home in Norway. Our farm was indeed typical. The original 5-room house is still in the core of a heavily remodeled house that still sits tucked amongst the tree belt and was one of 11 other buildings used for storing livestock and crops. My dad was in 4-H and raised hogs to show at the county fair, and my aunt specialized in cows. But over the past century, the agricultural landscape of this region we call the Midwest has been subtly yet dramatically changed. Early corn and livestock farmers cultivated crops in a standard 3-year rotation: corn, a feed grain, in the first year, oats or wheat, a food grain, in the second year, and clover or alfalfa that was mowed for hay in the third. This traditional crop rotation has been changed almost entirely to one focused on corn and soybeans, and further west we have wheat. As a percentage of all farmland, in 1925, the core of this region's landscape was somewhere between 60 and 80% harvested cropland. Fast forward to 2012, and you can see the increase in intensity in which this region's landscape is used to produce the various crops that it does. Today, we envision this landscape as devoid of crop diversity and has become that focuses mostly on growing corn, wheat, and soybeans. As evidence of this internal intensification, much of the region's core, and more recently on its periphery, pasture land, has disappeared. In 1925, with the exception of Illinois' Grand Prairie and portions of western Iowa and Minnesota and eastern Nebraska and the Dakotas, most of the region's farmland was anywhere from 25 to 50% pasture. Fenced fields have become so rare, especially in the region's core, that that when I saw this one a couple of summers ago while on a family vacation back home, I slammed on my brakes and pulled over. My wife gave me a disgusted look and said, "What are you doing?" I answered as only a rural geographer could, "Don't you see that fence?" Today, as expected, pasture land exists only in areas considered too marginal to farm at today's production scale standards, or where there is so little farmland that using farmland as the denominator makes some regions appear more important than they actually are. The animals that once used that pasture land and feedlots at farms, cattle and even hogs, have also slowly vanished from many parts of the Corn Belt, though not all of them. Considering all cattle, both dairy and beef, you can see that cattle were once ubiquitous throughout the region. Beef cattle concentrated in a swath from Minnesota southwestward towards Kansas, with cattle that were milked showing up most strongly in Wisconsin and central Minnesota, but that were also quite common on most farms throughout the Midwest. By 2012, the number of all cattle has risen from 29 million to 38 million, beef cattle now being found in a more slender arc from northwest Iowa down through Nebraska, other clusters where farms and cattle remain, but where the land is not well suited for other agricultural endeavors, and where cattle fattened on irrigated corn are found in feedlots from northwestern Iowa to northeastern Colorado to the Texas Panhandle, and where dairy cattle are now relegated mostly to counties in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, with other hot spots here and there appearing as a result of unique local factors that have either allowed dairy to remain as an important part of an otherwise non-dairy region, or where new opportunities have been created. Hogs were once closely associated with the traditional feed, grain, and livestock Corn Belt farming system. In 1925, hogs in 1925, and to a lesser extent cattle, were likely the most recognizable aspect of the Corn Belt other than corn. By 2012, 12 million more hogs have been added to the region, for the most part still in their typical home range. But instead of a few of them being found on just about every farm, thousands, even tens of thousands, are now found on only a handful of farms and in barns that house 1,000 or more hogs under one roof. Two of the most important aspects of the 1925 Corn Belt that have experienced severe declines have been horses, thanks in large part to the advent of tractors coming onto the scene shortly after the turn of the century. And oats, the preferred fuel source for the horses, have also virtually vanished from this region's agricultural landscape. This is the only set of maps I've shown you thus far where I had to change the legend by a factor of 10 on the right to be able to at least show somewhere in 2012 where oats remained, all of which are more or less in areas where there isn't much farmland there to begin with. Wheat has gone from occupying about 17% of the western part of the region's harvested cropland total to today where it occupies about 12% of that total. Still evident are the distinct and traditional spring and winter wheat regions of the Great Plains, with most of the loss of wheat having occurred in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and more recently along the Corn Belt's ever-expanding western and northwestern fringes that stretch up into the Dakotas. Because just about all turn-of-the-century Corn Belt farms had livestock, lands reserved for hay crops have also been on a steady decline. In 1925, while hot spots of hay production were found throughout much of Ohio, southern Illinois, and adjacent to the Des Moines Lobe and the Grand Prairie, the latter of which never having had a high percentage of farms with any livestock, even in 1925, today hay has been relegated like cattle to the more marginal areas of Kentucky, Missouri, eastern Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, as well as remaining part of the dairy region's agricultural landscape. And finally, we get to corn and soybeans. In 1925, hints of what was to come were already taking root in Illinois' Grand Prairie and on Iowa's Des Moines Lobe. In today's region, corn has become less important in sections of eastern Kansas, northern Missouri, and southern Iowa, and has continued its slow northward from the 1950s to the 1970s march, and westward from the 1970s to the late 1990s march, and most recently, over the past decade, a northwesterly movement into areas of Minnesota and both North and South Dakota. So this map is using something similar to, say, the Census Bureau's population center of gravity map to watch where corn is trending more towards these days. This brings us to soybeans. A century ago, they were little more than a curiosity and remain so for decades. They had been introduced into the U.S. as early as 1804. In 1909, only 1,600 acres were harvested for beans, and the 1925 Ag Census only reported them under the heading of annual legumes cut for hay. but they quickly diffused from their centers of introduction in east central Illinois, and early enthusiasts actually figured out some ingenious uses for soybeans. During the Second World War, with metals in short supply, the state of Illinois began making automobile license plates out of soybean meal fiberboard, but had to discontinue this experiment when goats began eating them off of the cars. But by 2012, soybeans are now as ubiquitous throughout the region as corn is, and in some cases, such as Ohio, in 6 of the last 8 censuses, Ohio has devoted more acres to soybeans than to corn. What we have just seen has been a series of maps that showed how various types of agricultural crops, livestock, and land covers have changed over about the past 90 years, but by using bookend dates that only highlight what once was and what is today. Soybeans were the key to transforming the traditional corn and hog farming system into the new corn and soybeans farming system. But their uneven adoption complicates any attempts to map the changes to the traditional system. The Corn Belt of 1925 was an apple, and slowly and unevenly over the past 90 years, that apple has changed into an orange. Between 1950 and 1980, the transformational period in the evolution of this region included large swaths of land devoted to growing the rotational crops of wheat, oats, and hay, and farmers began replacing those crops slowly to soybeans as they transitioned to a strictly cash grain farming system. By 1980, this transformation throughout much of this region had been completed, and a period of intensification and whittling away of acres that may have remained from the old system has continued to occur, spreading this new corn and soy cash grain system into the region's periphery where most of today's active change is occurring. Since 1925, in the 3 core states of the Corn Belt that have seen marked increase in the percentage of their annual incomes that come strictly from crops versus livestock. Where corn and soybeans were established earlier, in Illinois, for example, 1950s Illinois farmers were already obtaining over 40% of their annual income from the sale of crops versus livestock. Where livestock held on for a little longer, and where many still remain today, such as in Iowa, the same pattern is seen, but the values are lower. With the gradual transition to a corn and soy-based landscape, the need to keep livestock began to fade. In 1925, over 95% of all farms in those 3 states had cattle. From the 1950s to the 1980s, the trajectory of loss steepened, and by 2012, less than 30% of farms in these states still had cattle. Farms with hogs have declined even more precipitously, but with nearly an identical trajectory, from 75% in 1925 to fewer than 5% of all farms in these states having hogs in 2012. Peripherally, change has come more recently. With the diffusion of soybeans having begun in the region's core, they did not reach states like South Dakota until large part until the 1980s, and were not widely adopted until well into the 1990s. One driving force behind this change, and one of many, the 1996 Farm Bill, decoupled farm program payments from production decisions. What this meant was that farmers no longer had to plant what they had always planted in order to be eligible to receive government payments or get crop insurance. They were now free to plant the crops that would yield them the highest returns. From the late 70s and early 80s to today, basically this map is my lifetime, the vast majority of new acres of corn and soybeans have been found along the region's western periphery, with many counties seeing a 1/4 to a 1/2 square mile per every square mile increase in those crops. In southeast Nebraska, the introduction of corn and soybeans has been at the expense of mostly sorghum, a livestock-based feed crop that has been pushed out by farmers growing corn for its appeal to both the ethanol industry and it's the preferred feed for feedlot owners to feed their cattle corn rather than sorghum. And where you find corn, soybeans most assuredly follow. While in Barnes County, North Dakota, and surrounding counties, small grains such as wheat and barley and also sunflowers have been stripped from the landscape and replaced by corn and soy. Other drivers of recent land conversions in this region, many of which have been the focus of recent studies, include lands enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program, a government program that temporarily removed cropland from production. Many of those acres have recently returned to row crop production after the expiration of those 10-year contracts, as prices farmers can receive for growing crops surpassed government payments farmers were receiving for keeping their lands retired. Other technologically driven investments that have been part of this region for many decades, such as center pivot irrigation and drainage tile, have allowed farmers to continue to increase yields and profitability of countless tens of thousands of acres of land. Ethanol remains a topic of debate, with many pointing their finger at this driving force of change as the main, and in some cases only, culprit of land use conversion within both the region's core as well as along its fringe. But as you can see, since about 2010, this region's ethanol productivity, which mimics that of our entire country's productivity, has more or less flatlined, leaving one to wonder, why are still more acres of corn and soybeans being planted? One reason, but far from the only one, is that corn, and to a greater extent soybeans, are being shipped to U.S. ports in the Pacific Northwest for export abroad. In Minnesota, South Dakota, and North Dakota, over 100 facilities exist along rail lines, some which have been around for years and some that are very new, that can accommodate 110-car unit trains, a very efficient method of getting a lot of grain shipped a great distance very quickly. While once traditional rail elevators, such as this one in the booming metropolis of Andover, South Dakota, may have become relic features of the contemporary Midwestern landscape, the new elevator, which is situated 5 miles east of town, is capable of storing over 3 million bushels of corn, soy, and wheat, and loading one of those unit trains in just over 8 hours of time. With dozens of other new facilities like this that are a growing part of this region's new agricultural landscape, many of these facilities, complete with massive grain silos and bunkers, expansive loop rail systems, can be seen spread throughout both North and South Dakota. As each decade passes, residents on the rural landscape become fewer and further between, with those who are actually participants in any sort of agricultural endeavor comprising an even smaller proportion of the region's overall population. Counties of the Midwest, western states have seen dramatic long-term depopulation, with many counties having lost population 5 or 6 decades out of the past 6 decades, a portion of the region that many refer to as the Great Plains, and what Deb and Frank Popper wanted to refer to as the Buffalo Commons. At a more fine-grained spatial scale at the township level, John Fraser Hart and University of Minnesota cartographer Mark Lindberg identified areas of Minnesota that also lost population over the past 50 or 60 years, sifting the data out now to show that specific parts of rural counties, at the township level again, are losing population while urban areas are in fact gaining. In a quick analysis of a 7-county region centered on my home county of Watonwan in southern Minnesota, we can watch population in the late 1800s move slowly west from the Minnesota River Valley to a period where the region was the most densely populated in the 1930s, with nearly all townships having more than 15 people per square mile, to a reversal of that population growth during the middle to late 20th century, and to today's rural landscape where most townships now have only 5 to 10 people per square mile, with the exception of those adjacent to the area's larger population centers of Fairmont, New Ulm, or Mankato. Local scale changes show similar patterns. The white square identifies my family's farm in the late 1930s, and within a mile radius there used to be no less than 5 other working farms that have today been completely erased from the face of the earth. Ubiquitous features on the region's agricultural landscape have become redundant, no longer necessary in today's cash grain farming system. The old red barn that once proudly sat on nearly every Midwestern farm, which once sheltered countless head of livestock and thousands of bales of hay and bushels of grain from the harsh elements of this region's climate, have become relegated to structures that are now purposely burned by local volunteer fire departments to allow them to practice putting out fires. Abandoned farmhouses meet similar fates. This one, the Tuberg farm just to the east of Odin, Minnesota, had not been lived in for over a decade when the owner of the adjacent farmland wanted to farm the land on which the farmstead had sat for over a century. By the following spring, the tree grove had been cleared and the heavy machinery moved in to demolish the house and any other remaining farm-related structures. And a few weeks later, at the corner of 400th Street and 660th Avenue, an address for someone like me who grew up with a rural route number is still a little bit hard to swallow, the land on which that farmstead once sat was now ready to be planted to either corn or soybeans. But it's always important to take a step back, to reflect at how the past has changed, and to remember that change on the landscape is usually the exception and not the rule. And what today may seem like an all-out transformation from one type of farming system to another, and whose associated consequences are apparently throwing many socio-ecological systems hurling violently out of control, may one day, maybe another century or so down the road, appear as nothing more than a tiny blip in the continuum of change. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions for our speakers. Would anybody like to ask a question?
I feel compelled, John, to point out that Grinnell College, an alma mater, is in Grinnell, Iowa, not Davenport.
We already had this discussion earlier, didn't we?
For Grinnell,
I blame it on being right after lunch, I'm sorry.
But I started in Davenport, it was actually called Iowa College.
yeah, they moved it along.
I think I've destroyed my credibility entirely. Forget the rest of the stuff I said. Thanks for pointing that out, yes.
But I wanted to ask you about an issue that came up before lunch, out-migration. You're talking about class in small towns.
Yeah.
John McDerger in Sugar Creek points out it's the lower class that usually moves. So does that skew our sense that it's classless? People who hang around, leave records that we know more about tend to be more solidly middle class?
I didn't quite hear. Does that skew our view what?
Of class relations. You suggested that
Yeah.
small towns are comparatively egalitarian.
Yeah.
But if it's the lower class that moves on, how sure can we be of that egalitarianism?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point. Well, I think it's true that more successful people are more likely to stay for a long time. I mean, start with, like in Brookings, South Dakota, the Roods and the Fishbacks, who were here in the first year that the town was established, are still there. They have the big bank in town, and they have the furniture store in town, and that lots of less successful farmers like Pa Ingalls, for instance, kept moving around, and that would tend to create those kinds of elite families that maybe were the president of the church congregations or the Kiwanis Club. Well, you aren't going to have a lot of farmers in town in the Kiwanis Club. But I think it's also true that just walking around town this morning, we see the Van Ondel and the DeVos and the Hauenstein. Well, I didn't see the Hauenstein, but the Meyer. There's in larger places you have a greater opportunity to build that great kind of wealth than you do just by its very smallness. Small towns are more likely to be egalitarian. So the possibilities for spread between the poorest and the richest in a small town, just about by definition, are less. But then, there's always maybe that one family. You hear about people. I heard one the other day, 20,000 acres. And in my book on looking for history on Highway 14, there was a fellow out there who owned 17,000 acres of land. And, that still doesn't equate with the Walton family, who had 5 of the 10 richest people in the United States there for a while on the Forbes 500 list with one father, one mother, and 4 kids. So that's a stab at an answer. Maybe somebody else has another idea. Yes?
I heard that because studies have shown, particularly like in Iowa, Iowa's enjoyed pretty low levels of economic inequality. Recently, as the economic quality gap has been widened, no matter of concern in the United States, there are now a couple counties in Iowa that are kind of troubled, but there are these counties that, like you were just suggesting, there isn't that many people there anymore, but there's these large farms and so forth.
Right.
But I think historically, the levels of, say what you will about who moves in and who moves out, these towns have enjoyed pretty low levels of inequality, introduced egalitarian nature.
And there's a great effort to mask wealth, too. Sam Walton drove around in a beat-up pickup truck, and we were talking if it's tens or hundreds of billions of dollars that are 2 banker friends. I play basketball with them, and they may drive a little nicer car than I do, but anybody coming in outside of town, not knowing who they were, I don't think would have any idea that they have the kind of wealth they do in the town of Brookings.
Can I connect this to what Chris was talking about, or Chris's slide of these counties in Minnesota where, certain townships would have 4 or 5 family farms? And this is the way it was for a century or so. Is there any place in world history ever that has been more egalitarian than that, than these rural places in the Midwest where everyone had 80 or 160 acres for the most part that they owned? Maybe they had a mortgage, but they owned it. I mean, historically, say 50 years ago, the inequality levels compared to any other society in history was probably the lowest possible. You want to speculate on that?
I don't really, have that sort of a thought process when I'm out on, the landscape looking at these farms and talking to these farmers. But I would agree. I mean, I hear stories from my great uncles who have lived back then, lived in the 1930s and 1940s on these farms, and everyone was more or less just like their neighbor and very similar from one person to the next.
I can think of one place possibly. I lived in 6 small towns in the Midwest, but I also lived in the brand new suburb of Rolling Meadows, Illinois. Right up there, Rolling Meadows?
Yeah.
We got there about exactly 4 years to the day after the first house was built. And at that time, there were 2 styles of houses. One was 15,000, I think, and one was 17,000, almost by definition, until they built the carports and expanded the house, and some of them had more money. You were going to attract the kind of young family like we were that had 2 to 4 kids that could afford that price of house. And I would think that might be, at least for a short period of time, an example of a very egalitarian town of 10,000 people at the time I was there.
But what my point of all this was
Yeah.
to help explain this egalitarian
right.
ethos in the Midwest and where it comes from. I think you can trace it back to these homesteads
Yeah.
and how equal in size they were, and how much equality there was. And this sort of starts to
Right.
sink into the
Right.
soil and become part of the social code.
Ethos.
In contrast to, say, the American South, where you have big land barons, and then you have tenant farmers, and you have slaves, where there's, massive inequality. Whereas in Minnesota, it will give rise to a different kind of social ethic.
Central Illinois is a good example. On the Grand Prairie, it was initially too wet to farm until they were able to dig the ditches and put the tile in the ground. So you had kind of larger land barons there who, once that land was drained and we were able to farm it, actually was the first sort of cropland renting sort of region that cropped up in the United States, and it's sort of ubiquitous now across much of the Midwest. So.
I think the woman in the red over here has had her hand up for a while.
One of the issues I think you're skirting is the fact that many of these farms are now corporate farms. They're owned by groups of doctors and people like that. And your 160 acres is what they call a gentleman farm. And a lot of professors around here have those.
The data really show that corporate farms aren't necessarily taking over, especially the Midwest.
I'm from Colorado, so
yeah.
I see it differently.
You might have people who own the land that may be in business and they're using it as an investment opportunity. That's becoming more and more common. But the people who are still the farmers, that statistic has hovered, and I know there's less farmers today than there were 30, 40 years ago. Back in 1960, 1970, about 88, 87% of all of American farms were family farms. Today it's 88 or 87%. So the percentages stayed the same, but
And then all of the country, or
that's the national average, yeah. But there will be pockets where there's more corporately owned farms. But the notion that corporate agriculture is taking over the physical process of farming isn't necessarily.
the physical process, but it's the ownership. Once the corporation has taken over, they're going to tell you what to grow. And soy, interestingly enough, does fix nitrogen in the soil. So you have some benefit, but,
We have a question all the way at the back here.
Aside from wondering about the increase of the age of the average family, the diminished size of the average farm family, and pretty much the defeat of smaller institutions, including churches on the landscape, all of that makes it hard for me to say, however far you go in the future, it's just going to be called a beat. And when you combine it to the scale of production and concentration of capital, how you don't say that's a revolution, I don't know. But my question was, that was a comment. But my question is to you, particular Chris, what do you foresee, given the very convincing portrait you give, what does that mean for the air, the groundwater, and the soil, these increased sizes? If I'm a conservationist, and I heard what you said, should I jump with joy or leap with despair?
I think that varies farm to farm, person to person. I mean, I think a lot of what farmers do today is far better than what they've done in the past in terms of managing their land. The technological innovations of things like no-till farming and GPS and all those sorts of things have helped. Now, there is the counter to that where you have now farmers who aren't farming 160 acres, they're farming 3,000 and 4,000 acres. How can that be better for the environment? You know, you have one person now managing quite a bit of land, and that's the big argument, you know.
What about the carbon release from opening up all those lands with a plow, not having grass to bind the carbon? Does that bother you about local change and the concentration of capital? Do you see that as a technological problem, or is that just a beat?
It doesn't bother me. I always kind of think to myself, you know, with a lot of what's written now in geography, especially in environmental sciences about agriculture, you know, the term sustainability is thrown around pretty loosely sometimes. But I would venture to guess if you would go and talk to just about every farmer in Indiana or Illinois and Iowa and ask them, is what they're doing sustainable? They're probably going to tell you yes, because their dad did it, their grandpa did it. So I think they see sustainability in a different sort of temporal scale than what we're talking about with storing carbon and things like that. But there's actually less cropland today, you know, than there were a few decades ago. So, you know, even though CRP acres are starting to disappear, I think it's not as bad as what it's made out to be a lot of times. Yep.
Question up here.
I'd like to ask David Good to clarify when that window was, when the eastern Midwest developed industrially and got in before the Northeast could get there. Did the Civil War have anything to do with it?
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned that, because he never mentions the Civil War. And it was, the window was from 1860 to 1880. And I think one of the things that bothers me about the argument is that he talks about on the demand side on the Midwest side, that transportation improvements were a factor that you could get. There were more people coming in and all of this. But then he claims that, well, they had transportation problems from the east. So I'm not quite sure. I guess if you're way out in New York State, then you got to, before the railroads are in all the way. I'm not quite sure, but that's the window that he was talking about. And I think the Civil War must have a role, although I'm not quite sure what it is. It's such a big event.
Joe.
Thank you all for the presentations. This is super interesting. Enjoyed them all. Further to Nicole's point about this turnover, John McFerrer did a great job of describing, from a qualitative perspective, the turnover in 19th century communities. But Ken Winkle did a great quantitative job. And the
So I'm interested to know, but connected to that is the larger question that I'd like maybe the three of you to speculate on, that I'd like us to be part of the discussion, is what role does the personal and our personal experience play in our understanding of place? I mean, all three of you have sort of personal, I certainly do. How do we manage the personal? And from that is how much is what you're saying about Worthington generalizable? How far do you need it to be generalizable? And what's the particular kind of truth that we get at by talking personally that we don't get at in any other way? Just for one person.
So the first part you're asking, where did those people who lived in those farms, where did they go?
Why did your family survive and why did those other five?
They survived to the extent that they still live in the house. They don't farm the land anymore. So we didn't have enough land in our family to continue farming after the early 1980s. So if you drive that stretch of road from my hometown, or from where our farm is, up to the highway that runs up to the Twin Cities, there's probably 2 full-time farmers that live along that 7 or 8 mile stretch. So the people who move are moving because they've either retired and gotten out of farming, or their kids. That was the case with my generation mostly, is that their parents didn't want us to stay around and farm, even if they were farmers themselves. So many just moved into town, into retirement homes. A lot of these small little towns have spent a lot of money building retirement facilities for some of the older folks. And some just went off and found different paths in life. So.
And you didn't want to stay either.
No, I was old enough to just remember riding around in the tractor when I was a little kid, and that's about it.
I think that this whole question of a very, very good question, and it raises questions about what historians do, what social scientists do. You know, we use statistics. It's very dangerous to make generalizations from a small sample. I've got a small sample of 22 guys in here, and I try to explain how these individuals responded to their experience growing up on a farm, and they were obviously very unrepresentative people. If you look at the list, mostly people of vast achievement and wealth, and we all respond differently to these kinds of things. And I quote Garrison Keillor from one of his monologues that I listened to, and I happened to be taping it that day, and I went back and transcribed it, and I put it in the book, about him talking about how we can't generalize about people. Well, that would make us nominalists. You know, we just have to talk about individuals without making these generalizations. But we have to be very careful, I think. And obviously, I have some affection for the places that I grew up in, but I never thought I'd stay in a small town because I wanted to be a historian. You go where the jobs are, and I just wound up where I am accidentally. And most of these guys, the only person who stayed close to town was Henry Ford, who died within a few miles of where he was born, and Grant Wood, who went down the road in Iowa. So there's one thing about having good feelings about a small town, and another one about actually wanting to live in a small town. And most people, I think, get out of town who are able to and who have ambition and who want to go to the job, they get out. And the other ones decide that family's more important. The other thing I was going to say is, when I went to the OAH a couple weeks ago, I managed to go down through a little town where I learned how to read, Cuba, Missouri, on Old Highway 66. It's now on the interstate, and down the road in St. James, where my dad had been a preacher, I stopped. There's an 84-year-old barber there who I saw had a sign, $12 haircuts. I said, how do you make a living giving $12 haircuts? And he told me, well, there's this young guy down on the edge of town who's given $9 haircuts. And as I walked around town, I could see, you know, you can just see it. Go to St. James, Missouri the next time you go down Highway 44 and take a look around. And I think that's what we all have to do more. It's doing road research. And as I was walking around taking pictures on my camera, there was a long line of people waiting there, it looked like to me, at 9 o'clock in the morning for food distribution. And I know at our church at Ascension, every Thursday afternoon, there are about 20 people who help hand out food in Brookings to people who need food to survive. And it's all around us. I think the invisible poor are all around us, and maybe us well-paid historians need to get out of our classrooms and our offices. It's just a suggestion that we don't understand right now that huge gap that we read about in papers all the time is on, and I'm sure that if we went beyond downtown that's just remarkably wealthy and vibrant here, there must be a lot of poor people in Grand Rapids.
I'm not sure I'm picking up on what Annette said, but the way I interpret what you said is how does the person who's a person and the person who's a professional, how do you think about things like history? And for me, it's so a part of that whole question I was trying to deal with, actually, because I was for a long time interested in Central Europe, and then like that, I wasn't. And of course, this part of it had a long history. I don't know quite how it happened, but it happened. I was stunned because I had a project. It was a sabbatical. I kind of cheated on that because I didn't deliver what I was supposed to do. But I was compelled to inject the person that I guess used to be and now was into what I was doing. And I know one way it happened was that we would drive down to Illinois, where I was raised, about 50 miles north of Peoria. We would drive down and we'd go through these, this is before the 4 lanes started to come in. Now we don't do it, but we did, and it was great. We'd go through Iowa, and we'd go through southern Minnesota, and I would see small towns like the one I grew up in. Some were dead in the water, some were doing quite well, and always in the back of my mind was my own town just fell apart. It's just a shadow of itself. If it had been into food processing, what it could have been, because it was called the hog capital in the world, so why wasn't there a meatpacking plant in Kewanee? Because there were just hogs. It had more hogs per capita in the county than anywhere, at least in the early 50s. It was more of an industrial, it was more of an East Midwest kind of town. So when the boiler company that went out, valves and fittings, these were companies that had several thousand employees, and the Walworth one had 4,000 employees during World War II. And they were coming from Peoria, they were coming from the Quad Cities for the jobs. But that's the part of the economy that fell apart. Up here, in Minnesota now, where I live, there isn't that same kind of an issue. The issue is, well, everybody's got to eat, so we're okay. You have these rises and falls that aren't very aggressive, but in some cases, small towns have just disappeared because they were I think, so focused on one or two industries that they fell apart. But the other thing is leadership, and I've come to believe that the leadership of small towns is really essential. I have not done any research on this, but I think leadership more generally, you can see it here in Grand Rapids. Talking about the personal, when I met my wife, she's from Grand Rapids, her parents wouldn't even go downtown. They would not step foot downtown because it was too dangerous. I don't know that it was dangerous, but it was pretty dumpy. So how did Grand Rapids make this turn from furniture, and then that got taken over by Carol down south? How did it do this? And a lot of it was money, but money alone doesn't work. It's about leadership, and that's another personal thing that I'm really interested in, how what leadership is all about. And I think a lot of it has to do with understanding. So it's why I can't be a quantitative historian anymore, but I can't be another one because I'm too old to learn new tricks. But I'm really interested in this idea of leadership as a factor that is important. And you can talk about all the intangibles, the landscape and all of this, but somehow it's about how people grow up and who they become. And okay, if some of them move away, then that may limit the pool. Anyway, I'm rambling on, but for me, that question is really fundamental. And I think it is for all of us, and it is the older you get, the more fundamental it is, because you're trying to figure out, well, who am I really? How do I answer Annette's question about that was given to the gentleman? Now I forgot what I was going to say. What was your question to him?
What was Midwestern about?
What was Midwestern? That's what I'm trying to understand through myself, as somebody who lived away for a long time, raised a family, and then came back. Who am I? And I think that's a question that I'll never resolve, but it's fun to try.
And I think we've actually basically run out of time. So on that
I
profound
apologize for
note,
going on.
on that profound note, let's thank our panelists again.